book club lovers. I'm coming to you live from Harare, and today we are going through a book review of the book by Taiye Selasi, Ghana Must Go. Now, I have to say that it's going to be a little bit of a book club with a difference in terms of I'm not going to open with a quote. And I do want to just give this disclaimer. I may need to come back and do this again with a guest reviewer because there's so much rich material in this book. It's really worthy of bouncing off with another partner. But today, I'm going to take you through, obviously, my usual format of book reviews, the structure of the book, the timing, world building, space and rules and feel, and some of the key themes that struck to me. And of course, the reason why I've started or chosen this book review for June is because this month we're talking about family and we're talking about how loss shapes a family. So last week we had Malika and Lovu, and we talked about maternal loss and the space that it has in the family, and the space that it also creates in shaping motherhood. And I kind of feel the same about Ghana Must Go, the shape of paternal loss and how it shapes our ideas of fatherhood, but also about families and the space it holds and takes in our families. So, Ghana Must Go. Let's get started. So, Ghana Must Go is written by Taiye Selasi, who is an alumni of Yale and Oxford. She is Nigerian and Ghanaian by descent. And this is actually one of her full long form books, her first. Most of her other work is in short form and essay. The book is about a family called the Sais, a Nigerian Ghanaian family living in the United States. They prosper until the day their father and surgeon Kweku Sai is the victim of a grave injustice. Ashamed, he abandons his beautiful wife Fola and their little boys and girls, and causing the family to fracture and spiral out into the world. Um, the book opens up in the moments of Kweku's death and kind of begins to give us a feel of the family ties and the connections within that family. So, a couple of things here before we get started. Why the title Ghana Must Go? Some reviewers link it to the expulsion of Ghanaians from Lagos in 1983. And obviously, one of the first things we are aware of as we go through the book is the fact that Kweku Sai, or Dr. Kweku Sai, the surgeon, lived in poverty in Ghana and met Fola, who's more of a Nigerian princess. I mean, she comes from a bit more of a well-to-do background than him. And, they fell in love and they immigrate to America. And one of the interesting phrases I love about their union is that they were like two lost boats that came together and like crossed the sea to go to another place. So I think that that's quite beautiful lyricism in terms of the way that the book is written. The book is structured in three parts. So the first is mainly from Kweku's point of view, and it is giving us the account of his last moments, which are basically him moving from one room to another in his house. And in that process of moving from one room to another, there are specific impressions of his life that give us entry into how he got there, number one, and why his life is the way that it is. And most importantly, the ties to his family and his idea and sense of family and his value for family, and also the shape and space through which he feels different types of love. And it's quite clear from that first part, called Gone, that Kweku is deeply invested in his family. There is a moment for each one of his children that is tied to a physical feeling or a visceral impression he has as he falls to his death, having a heart attack. So it's quite interesting the way that that is written. And I'll get to that when I talk to the style of writing. The second part is going, and this is kind of the full circle familial response to the loss of the patriarch. And as we know from the get-go, we're reading a book about a man who, at some point in the trajectory of his family, left them or abandoned them out of shame. So it's quite interesting because there's also a feeling or an echo of double loss in the way that they all receive the news, but there is also done in a secular fashion, and the different ties as the news goes from mother to oldest son to daughter to youngest daughter to the middle son, and then back to the mother. Through that journey and that trajectory, we get a snapshot of where each child is, but also a picture of the impact the leaving or the first loss of their father has created on them and their ideas of life. So we definitely get a sense of the indelible marks our parents leave on us as individuals, both through the scars, but also through the gifts that we get. And I must say, for me, myself personally, reading the book, I think that that's interesting, that juxtaposition shines through. Then the final part is obviously now all the kids are gone to have gone to Ghana. It is entitled Go, and it is kind of like the reunion piece of the book. And they reunite on the beach, and their mother has now actually moved back to Ghana, or no, moved to Ghana through an inheritance that she got, and other sort of things that we don't want to give away. But I mean, the book is chock a block with family drama. Um, and I would say a lot of it is quite captivating if you're a person who either has strong ties to your family or possibly weak ties to your family and is curious about why that is. There might be certain things that would resonate with you in a book like this. So let's take a quick look at the cast. So we've got Kweku Sai, whom I've spoken a little bit at length about when we were talking, especially about the first part of the three parts of the book. And he is the father, the patriarch of the family. And Kweku is married to Fola Shade, and she's Nigerian. And she's a very enterprising woman. She's a florist. She's beautiful. And she's definitely able to nurture something in him and in his experience, and kind of strike him with some level of ambition, which propels him and drives him forward. But of course, he already comes to the table like that because, as we learn, when he describes his recollection of going to see his mother when she died, we get a sense of regret, because one of the reasons he had left Ghana was to get out of poverty, but he had always intended to return. And so it's very interesting the way that leaving and coming back plays out in Kweku's life. Then they have an older son, Olu, who follows in the father's footsteps in older years and becomes a doctor. And he's kind of like the perfect son. And then following Olu are a pair of twins. And so the twins aspect is very interesting because Taiye Selasi herself is one half of a twin. And there is a lot of cultural significance around how twins come to be and their connection that definitely comes through very much in the twin characters of this book. And it's set up very well and set up very interesting, but definitely one of the connections to, or biographical connections to, the author. And the twins are, the sister is Tewu and Kehinde, which is shorter for a much longer Nigerian name. And those names are specific to their role as twins. And the spiritual story behind it, or what Nigerians believe, is that twins are two halves of a soul that is too big to be contained in a body. And so the older twin sends the older half sends the younger one out to go and see how the land lays. And if the younger half does not come, then the older half follows. And so it is believed that the second twin is spiritually older and wiser and more mature. And there's definitely, some kind of parallel meaning, or rather illustration of that we see in the twins in this book. And then there's the youngest daughter, Shade, and Shade is named after the second half of her mother's name, and how she's named, and her coming into the world is told through her father's last moments, and it's quite very interesting how he collects that and how the name comes to be. And so, that's the cast that's coming to the story, but they come to us in different stages throughout their trajectory, from when they were young, babies, in their formative years, teen years, all through to university years, and as they are sort of young adults. And we see pictures, I think, of these different stages of their life told through this one main channel of, Kweku dying, the news spreading, and then the kids coming back for the funeral. And I think it's very interesting that um, there's that combination or connection between loss and our past, and making sense of our past, or reckoning with some things in our past, and also some element of reconciliation with things in our past, especially in terms of our family lives. And what I find very interesting in these characters and the different stages that we see is that one of the indelible marks the leaving of their father has created is a disillusionment with family, understandably so, but also some very unique experiences of working that out for themselves. So definitely Tewu has serious daddy issues. Definitely there are some, perfectionism issues. Definitely there are some ideas around the families that they then choose for themselves, the significant others that they then choose for themselves, that are wrapped up in their idea, or feelings of safety around family. So, there are some people choose to go into affairs. Some people are in very codependent, enmeshed relationships with people who, present a particular image of family that is so different to what they are. Other people are trying to resist the idea of family and create new structures and paradigms for family. But what I find so interesting about that in this book is that in the second section called Going, all of these children fall back on the initial bonds or family ties. So, the family is definitely fractured since the leaving of the father, and it didn't quite happen overnight. I mean, it unraveled over time as the shock of that leaving reverberated through their family, and certain decisions were made to cope with that by their mother, and also by them, and some of the situations they then found themselves in. So there's definitely a fracture that kind of happens. And for me, it feels like a slow fracture. So by the time that they're adults and now they're in charge of their own lives, there's an element in which they are scattered that's very much by intentional design and choice. And many of the different sub relationships in the family are kind of in a state of impasse. People are not speaking to each other. But immediately, as they feel the connection of loss now through the second leaving of their father, which is now the death of Kweku, um, and they feel it viscerally, physically, and they almost all seem to sense it spiritually before it happens. It's very interesting how they immediately fall back on the very same family ties that they've wrestled with and struggled with, represented by the adults that we see in the second section of the book. So I found that very interesting, and very interesting to see how family loss shapes our ideas of family and the families that we want and the families we want to become. So let's get down into some technical things. The narrative point of view is obviously third person, but it's multi perspective. So we keep bouncing off from different members of the family, but we are also seeing them at different times in their life, and it's not all chronological. The only chronological piece is the death and dying of the father, and the receiving of the news, and then the going to Ghana to lay him to rest. But in between that, as we're connecting those that journey, from his death and the reaction and then the reunion, we flash back and forth in a very non-chronological manner in all of their lives. And to be honest, it can be a bit challenging to begin with, but there's something about it that is very authentic and true to a family life. So I imagine when you sit at the dinner table with your family and you reminisce and you remember things, you often don't remember them in chronological order. And I think that's the power of family history, right? It's driven more by memory, our impressions and feelings about a time in history, but not necessarily that timeline in a chronological sense. I found that very interesting. But the way that this is written now, the way that Taiye Selasi chooses to show us this connection is, I think, there's a very clever play on ties. So they each trigger ties to another family member, and she follows the connections of those triggers, and it's very interesting to me the way she carries the connections of the triggers, because through those ties, right, the connection of the trigger. So, for instance, one of the triggers is where are his slippers? So Kweku dies, and he is not wearing his slippers. So he tells us why he's not wearing his slippers. But when he is going through that reverie in his moment of death, the next character to pick up that trigger, where is his slippers, is his daughter Tewu, and she takes us back to a very important moment in the timeline of their family. And her impression is, where are his slippers? And through that showing, we're told so much more than if Taiye Selasi had just told us, like this is what is happening. So I find that those connections through the triggers and the ties are very, very interesting. And how those triggers allow family members to observe other family members, sometimes unwittingly without their knowledge, which gives us as the reader, I think, a lot of in-depth and rich knowledge about who those family members are. So you really get a sense that you're being drawn into the family in a very natural and authentic, true to family way, as opposed to reading a story or storytelling about a family. And so those ties are very interesting to me through the trigger connections, the different perspectives that you then get on one person, their inner life, but then how other people observe similar moments, but from a different perspective, and how in a family, all of that is connected, all of that is circular, all of that creates the bonds. And those bonds are both individual and collective, and they are intersecting on many, many different levels. And so I think the greatest example of this, obviously, is the aftermath of Kweku's leaving and how Sade remembers it. Um, and she's very, very young. She's a baby. So the meaning and significance for her is very different to what it is like for her older siblings. Um, and so when she talks about it, it's completely different. It doesn't register the same emotional weight. But what registers for her, obviously, is the emotional weight for the rest of her family. And how she carries that loss, obviously, is in the relationship she then has with the parent that remains behind and the parent that she truly knows. So I think that's very, very interesting. Um, then, of course, there is in all of this the titular overtones from Ghana Must Go of the migration of an immigrant family in America and movement within West Africa, but also movement in America, and then movement of West African diaspora in America and London. And we see that in the scattering of the family. And we see that in the movements of Kweku and Fola, because they kind of do full circle in the book. So by the time that Kweku has died, Fola has actually moved to Ghana, and she's inherited a house and she's living there, and she's not living far from where Kweku is. And so I think that that's very interesting, because I think one of the recurring themes in Kweku's life that echoes, especially through in that first section, is the idea of too soon and too late. It's like he's never able to find the balance between those two timings. And it's very interesting the role that timing and space and distance then play in a family, and how we see that in this book. So, too soon or too late. And the too soon connection for him is obviously the premature birth of his youngest daughter, Sade. And the too late, I think, are some of the things that his children witness. Definitely his twins, Tewu and Kendry, they, I think, are the ones that witnessed the most pivotal moments in his kind of demise, and how it took a toll on him. And, obviously the way that that scars them, we see that in the book. And so, but in those instances, he's either too soon or too late. And at the time that Kweku dies, he's in his 50s. So there's an element of which he has also left too soon. And, this is echoed, obviously, I think, through the reaction of the oldest son more than any of the other children. So I found that very, very interesting, and the sense of timing, too soon or too late. And I think just the value of what that means, right, in family, is that loss always makes us reconsider what is too soon and what is too late in our family connections and family bonds. And then, of course, there's, all of the usual themes, I think, in a family story, family secrets, the things that we feel but don't say, but we all know are there. And, many other issues. And for this particular story, I think definitely issues of race because of the migrant connection, xenophobia, because of all of the moving around and what those mean in terms of what they're searching for in their quest to be a successful family. So that's the book, sort of in a nutshell. And I promise you, I haven't given too much away. I haven't given too much away at all. But there is a reading I want to do for you as we close out today's book club. And I chose it because um, it spoke so powerfully of paternal loss, which is what this book is all around. So in Kweku, um, we learn at the time of his mother's death that his father had left him and his family and all of his siblings, and they'd lived in abject poverty. That was almost constraining and too much for his mother. And this definitely is one of the drivers of his ambition and the need to make it good, but also to make it a good in a way that he can come back and demonstrate, um, you know, a certain kind of vindication for his choices to leave in the first place. Um, uh, and so that's taken away from him because his mother dies too soon. So again, we have that too soon, too late situation. And his mother dies in the first, sort of year of him being married and his eldest son being born. But from there, a few years later, after he has achieved that pinnacle and worked so hard, and it's definitely a beautiful partnership between him and his wife, and they're amazing passages around that, the connection between success and sacrifice in a marriage to kind of achieve this pinnacle of what the right kind of family is. Um, it is almost too much because he then misses the point of what his family need from him, which is for him to be there. So in his shame, he abandons them, and then is surprised when he returns 8 weeks later to find that they are not there. And so, there is the second kind of round of leaving. Um, and I think in that leaving, there's a working out within himself an aspect of the leaving that happened, obviously from his father. And then obviously the unintended but very common fact of death in his death later years, because after he returns and doesn't find his family, he then goes back to Ghana, and different things happen there, and there's almost like a rebuilding and a reconstruction of his life. But there's almost also a little bit of limbo because you kind of get the feeling that maybe he's intending to reconnect, to come back in some kind of way. And so in all of these cycles of leaving, I mean, you definitely see the impact of paternal loss. Um, you know, but also its trajectory from a generational perspective. So, the passage I want to read for you is actually not so much to do with Kweku, but Fola's experience of her father's death. Because what I find interesting is that, in all of this loss, there is an element of is the family solid enough? So that comes through, particularly through Sade's character, because of course she's the one who didn't really know her father. But then, there are also no grandparents to speak of because, on her paternal side, her grandmother died many years ago. And as we learn, through Fola's story, her mother died at childbirth, and then her father died when she was in her early teens. And so there is very much a looseness or a thinness to the family structure that is felt more by the youngest daughter, Sade, than any of the other children that Kweku and Fola have. But the real thing that I want to read from you is this experience of Fola's father's death. Um, and it's pretty much pretty soon in the second section of the book going, which I kind of feel like is the full circle response to um, Kweku's death. And it goes like this. It was him. He was there without question, though they never could confirm it. His bones turned to ashes, and REM dreaming, his fola, two bubbles, as rampant anti-Ebo programs kicked off the war. But she simply couldn't see him, not her father as she knew him, as she'd seen him from the table, bobbing out of view. It was someone else they'd killed that night, these soldiers whom she couldn't see, this victim whom they didn't know, anonymous as are all victims, the indifference of it. This was the problem and would be ever after, the block on which she sometimes feels her whole being stumbled, that he and so she became so unspecific. In an instant, that the details didn't matter in the end. Her life until that moment had seemed so original, a richly spun tale with a bright cast of characters. She, motherless princess of a vertical palace, this four-story apartment on Victoria Island. They, passionate, glamorous friends of her father's staff. He, widowed king of the castle. Had he died a death germane to this life as she'd known it, in a car crash, for example, in his beloved Deux Chevaux, or from liver cancer, lung to the end puffing chaos, swilling rum, she would have abided the loss, would have mourned, would have found herself an orphan in a four-story apartment, having lost both her parents at 13 years old, but would have been thus bereaved, a thing she recognized tragic instead of what she became, a part of history, generic. She sensed the change immediately in the tone people took when they learned that her father had been murdered by soldiers, in the way that they'd nod as if, yes, all makes sense, the beginning of the Nigerian Civil War, but of course. Never mind that the houses were targeting Igbos and her father was a Yoruba, and her grandmother Scottish, and the house staff Fulani, some Indian even. 10 dead, one an Igbo, minor details, no matter. She felt it in America when she got to Pennsylvania, having been taken first to Ghana by the kindly Sena Worsoni, that her classmates and her professors, white or black, it didn't matter, somehow believed that it was natural, however tragic, what had happened, that she'd stopped being Folashade Samayina, savage, and had become instead the native of a generic war-torn nation without specifics, without the smell of rum, or posters of the beetle, or a kente blanket tossed across a king-size bed or portraits. Just some war-torn nation, hopeless and inhuman, and as humid as war-torn nation anywhere, all war-torn nations everywhere. I'm sorry, they'd say, nodding yes in agreement, as one says, I'm sorry when the elderly die. That's too bad, but not that bad. More how these things go in this world. In their eyes, not a hint of surprise. Surely broad shouldered, woolly haired fathers of natives of hot, war torn countries got killed all the time. How had this happened? It wasn't Lagos she longed for, the splendor, the sensational, the sense of being wealthy, but the sense of self surrendered to the senselessness of history, the narrowness and naivete of her former individuality. After that, she simply ceased to bother with the details, with the notion that existence took its form from its specifics. Whether this house or that one, this passport or that, whether Baltimore or Lagos or Boston or Accra, whether expensive clothes or hand me downs, or florist or lawyer, or life or death, didn't matter much in the end. If one could die identityless, estranged from all context, then one could live estranged from all context as well. And that passage struck me because it occurred to me also at this time that we're living in, with things happening all over the world, conflict, but also us having gone through the global conflict of the COVID pandemic, that many have experienced a unique, debilitating, devastating family loss in a little bit of the same way that the character Fola describes the genericness of her father's death. And, this is the thing, isn't it? That loss, when it is felt at a family level, is probably more grave than any other loss. In any of the other relationships we hold in society, it is life changing, it is life defining. But sometimes when that loss is layered through or filtered through historical events, it can also be um, filtered through a generic sort of conveyor belt system of platitudes and acceptance. And so that was just a thought that struck me. I thought that that was very well written, among many very well written passages in the book. If you've read Ghana Must Go, I'm interested to hear what you thought of it. If you would like me to do a second review of the book with another reviewer, let me know in the comments. But other than that, it's been good to be with you live for a change this winter, and we will be back next week, Wednesday, with another fabulous story from an African female author. Until then, stay warm, stay safe, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.